Welcome back to Builders of the Broken Bazaar. I'm your host, Dr. Tabish Zaman, and today's conversation begins with people which you and me only seem to remember during crisis. I'm using the word and the term Rohingya, one of the most persecuted communities on earth. More than 1 million Rohingya have been displaced from Myanmar. The entire villages have been erased and families have been separated across borders. There are children who are born into camps who've never once seen a stable home. And yet, despite decades of displacement, statelessness, and violence, the Rohingya story is still too often reduced to headlines. We talk about it in terms of numbers and humanitarian language. But I strongly believe displacement is never just physical. It changes memory, identity, language, and the way people learn to trust. The way children inherit fear before they inherit stability. And the most cruelest part of this displacement is you are constantly expected to build while carrying the grief of what has been destroyed. And my guest today knows that personally, that reality. Yasin Arafat is a human rights advocate, a civic engagement leader, and more importantly, a storyteller. But more than the titles, he represents something deeper, the refusal of a people to disappear quietly. Because when systems erase community politically, culturally, and economically, storytelling itself becomes resistance. Memory becomes resistance. Simply remaining visible becomes resistance. Which is why I'm honored to welcome Yasin. Welcome to Builders of the Broken Bazaar.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tabish Zaman. I'm so glad to be with you on this podcast. Thank you so much for having me today.
No worries at all, Yasin. We have so much to explore today. I want to know a bit more about Yasin. And again, we're talking about your community, we're talking about your people. And what is common across them is the displacement. But before displacement, before labels, before them becoming a refugee, I want to talk about home. I want to talk about your home, the community's home. So, can you take us back to the earliest memory of Rohingya life? What do you remember? And again, introduce yourself to the audience, who you are, and what is it that you do.
Thank you so much for having me on this podcast today. My name is Yasin Arafat from Burma, Myanmar. I fled to Bangladesh to escape persecution and sought refuge in the world's largest refugee camp, which is located in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh. And I was in the refugee camp for more than 5 years, and I was resettled in the United States. And I'm a human rights advocate working for refugees in the United States. So to cycle back to the question that you just have asked, well, I really love to answer this question, and I'm looking for people who would be interested in learning more about my identity and the memory and about the Rohingya people specifically. So honestly, when people hear the word Rohingya, they immediately think about refugee camp, displacement, or violence, persecution that they have been facing for decades in Myanmar. But my memories are not only about politics. They are about people. They are about community, family, culture, and belonging. I remember growing up in an environment where people look after each other, even when families had very little, they still shared what they had. And there was this a strong sense of humanity and connection. I remember hearing conversation between elders, children playing together, families gathering, and people having to protect normal life even during difficult times. And I think that's something the people rarely sees. Before becoming refugee, we were simply people living our lives, carrying dreams, tradition, and hopes for the future, like everyone else, like yourself. So sometimes I say this to the people. People see refugee history from the moment we flee, but people rarely ask about the life that we had before we were forced to flee our home. And that part matters too, because our identity didn't begin with displacement. It
Mhm.
from a normal life, just like yours.
And that is so well said. Yes, and which is why I'm so interested in learning more and more about this. Because when we talk, like you rightly said, when we talk about Rohingya, people look at that frame through violence. Obviously, displacement is central to it. But every displaced community, you have something about them. And what I want to know today, and what my audience would love to hear about it, is parts of Rohingya culture, tradition, or everyday life, which you feel now that you're in United States of America and you've built a life, and you're trying to build a life for others as well. What part of those culture or tradition which people really don't know about, or people don't see enough, because it is cast aside as something different altogether. Can you share things with us which we don't know about in terms of culture and values and beliefs and tradition?
Yeah, of course, definitely. So I think the people mostly sees our suffering and the persecution that we faced back in Myanmar and the weakness, because people would, when people say that they are refugee, they see us with the eyes of supporting and with the eyes of displaced communities, right? So people mostly sees our suffering, not enough of our humanity, the humanity that we have for the people too. So people see images of the camp, people sees that the image of the Rohingya people while they were fleeing, right? But they don't always see the culture, the family bonds, and the hospitality, the resilience, and the emotional strength within the Rohingya community. So they don't see mothers trying to protect hope for their children. They don't see young people dreaming about education, dignity, despite enormous barriers, right? So the Rohingya identity is not only connected to persecution, it is also connected to survival, memory, faith, storytelling, and preserving culture despite attempt to erase it, right? And honestly, one thing that I always try to remind people is that a community should not always be known by the violence committed against them, but also by the humanity they continue to preserve afterward.
But let's look at some of the things in terms of the community before the displacement and the community you were part of. What was it like? What was life like before the displacement actually happened? And again, such a huge group of people being uprooted from one place and then having to look for an alternative. But do you have any memory of that life? Do you know of stories? Do you know of people, in and around you who had a life and that life was working well for them?
Right. Well, as a child, before I fled to Bangladesh in 2017, people don't think deeply about the identity or belonging, because I naturally assume that I belong nowhere. And well, people might assume that the world has a place for me, but displacement changed that understanding completely. For many refugees, especially like me, before I became a refugee in Bangladesh, the home that I had back in Myanmar slowly became something really emotional rather than physical. Sometimes homes become memory, sometimes it becomes language, family, or culture. Sometimes it becomes a feeling that you spend your whole life searching for it again and again. And honestly, I think one of the saddest realities of displacement is that you cannot leave a place physically, but emotionally. Part of you never leaves.
Which is why I'm so grateful, Yasin, that you're here with us and you're sharing your story. Because the tragedies of displacement is, for people outside, it's only visible when the suffering is on display. When people suffer, that's what catches people's attention. But, some of the numbers, for example, in 2017, more than 740,000 Rohingya fled Myanmar within a matter of months. But each of those lives had a moment behind them. And again, a moment which forced them to leave where they were. So, my question to you is, for you and your family, what was that moment like when it was okay, we might not be able to stay? And again, I suppose it had all to do with fear as well, isn't it?
Well, yeah, sometime there comes a moment when you stop thinking about the situation as temporary, right? So for me, it wasn't just one dramatic moment when I knew that living in Burma was not really possible for me after the crackdown that took place in August 2017 against Rohingya people. So it happened gradually, and as it has started noticing fear becoming part of everyday life, and I see uncertainty became normal, and I watch adults around me carry a stress, anxiety constantly, and eventually I realized that the life that I once knew may never be fully returned. Right, so that realization really changed me emotionally, and specifically when I experienced it as a kid in Myanmar. And I think displacement forces people to emotionally mature much earlier than they should. So when people lose a certain sense of innocence because survival suddenly becomes part of the reality. And one thing I carry deeply is the thought that no one should grow up learning fear before learning freedom as a child. Well, I believe this is what I believe.
Do you mind sharing us how old were you when you had to go through this?
Well, I was around 12 to 13 years old when I was going through all of this in Myanmar.
Okay, and I think that's a massive moment for you and, of course, your family as well. But when we talk about survival that way, it's very difficult to process what's happening. So, looking back now where you are and you're doing so well, like I said, for yourself and for your community, when you reflect back on, do you think it has psychologically shaped you? And again, it might be an opportunity for you to tell others as well what people actually misunderstand about refugees, because that is the heart of everything what we are talking about. People don't realize what you go through when you are being displaced and when you're trying to survive in one place to the other.
Right. Well, I think people often see refugees only through the lens of suffering, but refugees are also people with leadership, talent, and creativity, intelligence, dreams, and enormous resilience. And people survive unimaginable things, and they still continue to rebuild. Right. So, if I personally talk about my refugee life, when I was forced to flee Myanmar in 2017 after the influx, there were journalists who were doing news and saying that these are the Rohingya refugees coming from Myanmar and sought in refuge in Bangladesh. So they also count us not as a human. They say this is this number of people settle in this block in this camp, and these are this number of people going to this office to receive this kind of humanitarian aid. So in those moments, they count us as a number, not as a human, not as people. So these are the saddest part of my life, I would say. And people always forget to understand one thing is that we are compassionate, that we are passionate, and we have talent that that we have talent which we can't show to the people just because of the identity that we hold become refugees. So I want people to understand that the people who sought refuge and the who sought refuge who are going to different countries or neighboring places just to save their life, they shouldn't be counted as a number. They should be counted as a human, as people. And I can challenge that and I can prove that they can shock and surprise those people who are counting them as a number. These people can shock them and surprise them by doing a lot of good things when they are given opportunities, when they are given a place to live like a normal human being, like you and me.
That is such an important point. Normal people like you and me, and again, given how they're treated as numbers, but your advocacy is very important here, Yasin. And you are an important voice in what you're trying to do, because the number, the research is suggests how people are surviving on food assistance, which is as little as $7 to $12 per month per person, and that is nothing compared to what we are seeing in terms of survival. So, what I want to ask you is, because you have worked you have worked tirelessly and your work shows there as well. You are close to people and you're trying to bring them up through your advocacy. Can you please explain to us what does this long-term prolonged displacement does to someone like you and me when it comes to identity and dignity? Because these are very important words here on this podcast. Someone for too long, in that limbo, in that displaced situation, what does it do to someone like that?
Well, honestly, it is very difficult to explain statelessness to people who have always had citizenship, because most people never have to think about whether they legally belong to the place and to the country they are living, because they have citizenship. But when you don't have citizenship, and every part of life become uncertain, and your education, movement, safety, future opportunities, and even your identity, right? So statelessness is not only a legal issue, it affects dignity and even psychology. Imagine growing up in a world where your existence constantly feels questioned, right? And one thing that I always say is that citizenship is not just paperwork for some people, but for a stateless community, it becomes the difference between dignity and exclusion, right? So human beings are not meant to live permanently in survival mode. When people spend years or generation in refugee conditions, it affects mental health, self-worth, hope, and identity. So people begin feeling trapped between uncertainty and invisibility. And I think one major misunderstanding is that people assume refugees only need food and shelter, but human beings also need dignity, and refugees are human beings too. So they need opportunities, education, freedom, and the ability to imagine a future just like yours. So people cannot heal if they are forced to permanently live in limbo.
And that is so well said again, Yasin. I think that's such a profound statement in terms of, and it's simple as well, and it's very important for us to understand that way. But again, in your own journey, have you had these issues of explaining what statelessness is all about? Because for people in the West, and again, large population, citizenship is a right, they exist legally. They have got their numbers, they've got their NI number, they've got their identity. But for large group of refugees, that is a real struggle, isn't it? So what does it feel like when your entire existence, it becomes so dependent on a system, again, which is so layered as well? How do you explain that? How do you work that out? That is a real struggle, isn't it?
Right. Well, there are people who still misunderstand about the refugees who are spending generations in the refugee camp. And I think one major misunderstanding is that people imagine refugee camps as temporary place. But for many communities, displacement lasts years or generations. Specifically for Rohingya people, you are aware of the Rohingya refugees who came to Bangladesh in 2017, but there are also people who came to to the refugee camp in Bangladesh in 1992, right? So there are people that last in the refugee camp for the generations, and people are still understand about their lives. They think that refugee camp is a temporary place, but it is not. And another misunderstanding is that refugees are only surviving physically,
Yeah.
but in reality, people are also fighting emotional battles, fears, and hopelessness, trauma, uncertainty about their future. And refugee camps are not only places where dreams disappear, right? They are also places where dreams struggle to survive. And I think I'm
And again, which is why we are so glad to have you, because when I look at the number, again, over 1 million people, million Rohingya displaced globally. But still, and again, when I was doing my research, I was looking through voices, and I've been looking through voices in terms of, them coming up. For example, we are very lucky right now where, what is happening in Palestine or what is happening in Syria, what happened in Syria, Lebanon as well, what we see. There are people who come forward, they make a name for themselves, and they're talking on behalf of group of internally displaced individuals. But what was fascinating to me was that when it came to Rohingya, it was a real struggle to find. Again, it might be my ignorance, but finding the voice who can actually talk about Rohingya is actually very difficult. And that tells us something. That tells us something that you can discuss a community endlessly on a news panel or in a conference, but they are not heard enough. We don't hear enough about them, which is why your work, Yasin, matters to me and matters to this podcast a great deal. So when you speak publicly about Rohingya experience, what responsibility do you feel, or what is it that you carry in your heart and your mind when you talk about it? What is it that you're aiming for?
Well, I feel like if I don't tell my own histories and the histories of my community, people will define the history of us for their own understanding and often without noise, contents, or humanity, or even without reality, right? So storytelling is very powerful because it preserves memory, identity, and truth. And for many communities, storytelling became resistant, and I believe this deeply. When people try to erase a community, telling the history becomes an act of survival. Let's say if I don't educate people about the history and about the genocide and the facts behind the Rohingya community, how can they know who we are and what we survived and why we had to flee Myanmar and sought refuge in Bangladesh? If I don't share all these histories, how can they understand this? This is the reason I see this as my duty to educate people about the Rohingya people and what we suffer and why we needed to flee to Bangladesh and sought refuge.
Again, that was survival in displacement, Yasin. But have you gotten support? Have you looked at people? Do you find individuals, or do you find people from the other part of the world helping you out in your endeavor to where what you do in terms of your advocacy?
Well, there are kind individual and a lot of supporting people around who really come forward to support refugees like myself because one thing that I always say and share in events when I speak as a panelist is that when you create a system, people will come and use it because they will feel really comfortable and trusted using those systems. And let's say if we talk about the LinkedIn, the professional app, the CEO of LinkedIn doesn't own all the posts that we do, right? He just created them and we are using it. So likewise, when it comes to support system for refugee youth like myself, we have to show our compassion. We have to show our talent. We have to prove the people, the community out there that we can do this. And in that way, we can draw their attention. So from my personal experience, working as a human rights advocate and working with so many different organizations in different aspect for different aspect actually, I feel like there are a lot of supportive people and people would eager to support when we show them and when we prove them we can do this.
So when you're doing this, when you're trying to speak up and when you're trying to tell stories, I'm sure you're very well connected to what we see happening in and around us. From your own experience, what is it that stops people? And I'm talking about the broader population here in the UK or in the United States of America or Europe. What is it that stops people, or where is the roadblock for people not to hear enough about Rohingya? Why don't we make enough noise about Rohingya? Because again, like I mentioned earlier in my intro, this is one of the most, widely persecuted community on earth. What stories can we tell? And how can we tell that story so that people are aware of the suffering of a community?
Well, I think people still don't hear enough about the Rohingya youth leadership, education, creativity, and ambition that the Rohingya people have. So too often, Rohingya are portrayed only as victims, but there are so many young Rohingya people trying to study, organize, and advocate, reveal future despite all the challenges and the barriers that they are facing. And I think one important message is that our suffering is part of our history, but it is not the entirety of our identity, right? And one thing that I have found out working closely with my community as well is that when we were in Myanmar, we didn't have the chance to go to a school to learn education freely like other community existing in Myanmar. So the weakness came from that educational the restriction on the educational opportunities, because when people are not educated, when they don't go to a school, they have less ideas about how they can shape their future, how they can create, how they can educate themselves and the people about their situation and who they're right. And they even don't understand about their right because they were not given the opportunities to learn about their right, to learn about the human rights. And I understand that, and I think that in order to educate people outside of the Rohingya community mostly surviving in the Rwanda refugee camp need educational opportunities. In that way, they can educate themselves, and from those aspects, they can learn that they also deserve human rights, like so many of like others around the world. And in that way, they can speak for themselves, and everybody, when they will understand that, and nobody will stay silent for the rights that they deserve.
That is so true. That is so true, Yasin. Now, the more I look into your work, Yasin, I see so much positivity coming out of it, which means you're so focused around upliftment. You're so focused around, talking about, how we can go forward. Has it ever come to you, Yasin? Do you ever wonder? Do you go to the core questions as to why this has happened? Why this has happened in the first place? Why have we left this place? Why have we had to uproot ourselves and, build a new life somewhere else, irrespective? Do you come to terms with it? Do you ask yourself, or do you look for answers there?
Well, Rohingya are the indigenous people of Myanmar, but the military, the Burmese government have been oppressing us for
Yeah.
decades, restricting they restricted us from the basic needs, from from the opportunities that we need in order to have the sense of understanding about who we are, about what our rights are, right? So they first they block the way of going to a school for Rohingya people, and they made the entire community uneducated, right? So in that way, when they come to our villages, when they oppress Rohingya people, they don't know that they deserve to live as other Burmese ethnicity in Myanmar, because they were never given an opportunity to go to a school and learn what their rights are, right? So in that way, they could oppress the Rohingya community and launch the brutal crackdown against us, which led nearly 1 million Rohingya flee Myanmar in 2017
Yeah, yeah,
and sought refuge in Bangladesh.
yeah, yeah. So you reckon education is at the heart of this, of course. And again, you've explained it to us. But now that you're in United States of America and you've lived through that, you've seen it, do you wonder about the international response as well, and how the international community responds to Rohingya in specific? And again, for me at least, it tells about how I'm seeing, the selective empathy which comes into play. And again, power comes into play. So do you understand your people? And again, do you inherit from them, or do you infer from them that Rohingya suffering has been normalized altogether?
Well, one thing that I understand is that empathy is often political. Some crises receive immediate global attention.
And thank you for saying that. Thank you for saying that. Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, so some crises receive immediate global attention while others slowly become normalized. And I think that the reality can feel painful for displaced communities because it makes people question those suffering, receive urgency, and whose suffering becomes background noise, right? And at the
Mm-hmm.
same time, I have also been ordinary people. I have also seen ordinary people, activists, journalists, and advocates continue standing in solidarity even when the government fails. And
Mm-hmm.
that reminds me that humanity still exists even within the broken system.
Mm-hmm. Now, your work, the way you have been spending your time, you are clearly supporting the refugee and the immigrant community in and around you. You're trying everything for them, but more importantly, your advocacy, which is very, very crucial. So, your journey alone is very extraordinary. But when we talk about refugees, how do you rebuild? How do you, so someone from Myanmar, someone from having lived in Bangladesh for a while, and now in a Western world, how do you rebuild a sense of belonging? What is it that you do? Because the system is telling you you don't belong anywhere. And again, that goes in your conscious mind, isn't it? That is there at the back of your head. How do you build that? What does sense of belonging mean to you? And how what do you do personally to navigate all these issues around, a different country, a different culture? You know, it's a very, very vast system altogether.
Well, when I had to flee Myanmar and sought refuge in Bangladesh, I was completely broken knowing that I sought refuge in Bangladesh. So let me share a quick history with you.
Please, yes.
When I arrived in the refugee camp in Bangladesh, after a few days, I went to an office in the refugee camp where
Mhm,
everybody was called to go to after a few days of our arrival in Bangladesh. And I also went there with them, and they announced that they're gonna give us an identity card. And I
mhm,
was very happy. I felt a mix of happiness and emotion at the same time because I
mhm,
was very excited about the identity card that they announced to give us. And after standing in the line for a few hours,
mhm,
it came to my time to receive that identity card. And I went to the to the staff who were giving those cards with our name on it. And my name was called, and I went there and they gave me a card, and I saw my name on that card, and I was holding that card and looking at it again and again. And I felt a mix of emotion and also happiness, and I excitedly asked a staff from that office to explain me what this card meant and why I was given this card. And I wasn't very smart in English, and I didn't. I knew a few English during that time, and those things on that card what was written in English. So I asked a staff to explain me what is written on that card, and the extra staff gently and silently and emotionally explained me that this is your identity now. This card says that you are refugee, you lost everything, and you don't have
mm,
a place to live like like a citizen, and now you are a refugee. This card tells that you are a refugee. So when I heard that, I was completely broken, and the dreams that I carried,
mhm,
I have lost those dreams. When I fled to Myanmar, I didn't come by myself. I also brought my dreams that I had when I was a kid, right? And the
and
dream that
you were so young, yes. You
and
were
I
so young.
and I was so young, and I even got those dreams when I heard that I was registered as a refugee in Bangladesh, and that was my identity, which defined me as a refugee. And I asked them repeatedly, "What does refugee mean? Who refugee mean, and who they are?" They also explained me that refugees are those who lost their country and who can't go back to their country and need to live in a tiny place in a tiny shelter built by tarpaulin and bamboos. I was completely broken to hear those things, those words, and the dreams that I had actually really faded away. And I gradually came to understand that as this identity card defined me as a refugee, I cannot give up here. Even though this defined me as a refugee, I shouldn't end up being a refugee. I should continue with the dreams that I have And with that consideration, while growing up, I start working for the community, for my community. Even in the displaced camp, I work for the community and contributed to the society in ways possible. And at the same time, continuing the dream to rebuild my life and to live back to my life. And with those dreams, I continue to live in the refugee camp, at the same time searching for opportunities. And
Yeah.
finally, with my effort and the dreams that I had, which I didn't give up on living in the refugee camp, at the end of 2022, I was given an opportunity to resettle in the United States, which completely changed the direction of living my life, and that changed the direction of my life, and it gave me a sense of reassurance. It gave me a sense of belonging. Now I feel like I belong to this country, and I'm really grateful to the United States and to the society that welcomed me in this country, which allows me to rebuild my life and live a normal life again like a human being.
Yeah, and we are really grateful that you shared this story with us, because I believe you were there 5 years in that refugee camp. But then you worked across organizations like World Food Program, Danish Refugee Council, and again, you have integrated professionally in the United States of America. That's a journey very few people actually get to take in this chaotic environment. But let me ask you this, Yasin: are you an emotional person? Do you consider yourself as very, like, I'm very emotional? But what about you? Do you consider yourself having lots of emotion in you?
Well, I have seen people who get emotionally broken too easily,
Mhm.
and they even forget what they have to do. Well, I would say that I'm an emotional person, but I don't forget what my responsibility is and what I
Okay.
have.
So we can say you're very pragmatic, and you obviously, all these years having gone through that experience, do you feel have you had those moments where you talk to yourself and you tell how exhausted you are carrying some of those stories of what you've gone through and what you have seen in and around you, but then you keep on moving, trying to create not only for yourself, like I said, you're such a great advocate for others as well.
Yeah, so while living in the refugee camp, the trauma of displacement that I was carrying was very heavy for me to carry as a young
Mhm,
man.
mhm, mhm.
But the dreams that I had, I never gave up on that. And I always think of carrying those dreams and
Mm.
having a chance again in my life, having a second chance to live my life back, to get back my life, to get back my childhood.
Yeah.
Even though I felt exhausted with the trauma of displacement and with the responsibility for my family, well, there are moments when I feel exhausted with all this trauma and the responsibilities that I had to carry, but I never give up on the dreams that I had. And this is what brought me to the United States today, because there are 1.3 million Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, and I was the first person to be resettled from Bangladesh in the United States in 2022.
Now, when I look at the numbers again, yes, and I feel the demographic of the Rohingya refugee population, look at it, it's amazing to see more than half of that is under the age of 18, which again means thousands of young people, they're growing up in displacement. Again, most of them have never seen Myanmar. And again, parents far away in terms of what they've gone through. But more importantly, their future is being shaped inside what you have actually described in those camps. So as someone who's advocating for that group of people, what worries you the most about the future of young Rohingya people?
Well, I think the Rohingya people, understand that the feeling deeply that they move forward, adapt to a new environment, learn new systems, and build a new life. But emotionally, certain memories never fully leave them, because
Mm,
there are always a part of them which is connected to what they lost, right? So sometimes
mhm.
it's like you are emotionally living between past and present. At the same time, you are also trying to build a future while also carrying memories that continue shaping you. And I think one painful realities of displacement is this: people may eventually find safety, but part of their heart remains attached to places and memories they never fully return to.
Mhm, mhm. Now, you were at TEDx, I believe, and you had so many wonderful things to say at that TEDx. But I would ask you this. We spoke a lot about the challenges and the barriers and some of the experiences. But what is your goal for them? And again, given more autonomy and given more authority and more power and more resources, what would a life look like for Rohingyas in terms of where they are right now? And what is it that you envision for them, a good life?
Well, when people are displaced for too long and when injustice is ignored, it slowly becomes normalized. And I think
Mm,
one of the biggest responsibilities that I have as a human being is to speak up for dignity and humanity on specifically when communities are being erased, silent, or forgotten, and when they continue to face displacement, while when they continue to face challenges and barriers. What keeps me motivated and keen on is the hope that maybe future generation of Rohingya youth can inherit more opportunity and visibility than previous generation did. And as you may know that I'm truly connected to advocacy work, and advocacy is not only about speaking against injustice, it is also about protecting hopes. And
yeah.
remind myself that if people who survive injustice remain silent, history becomes easier for them to repeat.
Yeah. So are you in a good space at the moment? Yes, in terms of the work you're doing and what you're looking to achieve through your work?
Well, I would say that I'm in a good place and good condition
Hmm.
with a lot of opportunities. Well, one thing that I want to share out there with the people who might listen to this podcast is that there are opportunities everywhere. Even if you are a refugee living in a limbo, there are also hidden opportunities which is waiting for you. But the thing that
Mm,
is, you have to look for those opportunities, and opportunity will not come to your door randomly and knock your door. They won't come to people's door normally. You have to
mhm.
work hard for it, and it will knock you. It will bother you. So the people who are going through the same experiences and the situation that I once did from 2017 to 2022 in Bangladesh, I would say that look for opportunities and never give up on your dreams. If you continue to carry your dreams, there will be thousands of opportunities come to you, which is waiting for you.
Thank you for that, Yasin. Thank you for that wonderful note with which I will now go to the final section of our discussion. Now, this is something which is what we call quick fire round, which is all about your first response, one word or something which you carry in your heart at all. So I'll be asking a few of them and then I will close our discussion. Tell us one memory of the home you still carry.
One thing I still carry deeply is the sense of community. I remember how people supported each other even during difficult times. There was
Hmm.
this feeling that nobody should suffer alone. And I think that memory stays with me because it reminds me that humanity can survive even in hardship.
Thank you for that. Would you tell us or would you educate us something which we really don't understand about refugees? Is there something which you feel people misunderstand when it comes to refugee, and especially Rohingya?
Well, people might misunderstand about refugees or Rohingya. I think people often see refugee only through the lens of suffering, and people see us from the media, from the social media. But Rohingyas are also people with leadership, talent, compassion, creativity, intelligence, and dreams and resilience. People survive unimaginable things, and still they continue to reveal in their life. And whether they are refugees or Rohingya, they shouldn't only be seen by what they escape from, but also for what they are capable of becoming and doing in the future.
Okay, thank you for that. And my last question, I promise you, I won't quiz you any further, but give us a moment which you feel changed you forever.
Well, I am very interested in listening to podcasts and motivational quotes and motivational histories that people always share. And I'm a big fan of former President Barack Obama. I read his histories all the time and I watch him on internet. So when I see him coming in the United States as a kid and as a black man as well, as you might know that there were a lot of, well, they were really politicized before previously, and coming as a black young man to the United States and becoming a president is not really easy and it's not normal. So when I look at the people like former President Barack Obama, it gives me a sense of understanding that I'm also a human like them. And if they can become a president in the United States, coming from a different country, why I can't chase my dream? Why I can't achieve my goals? So when I listen to those kind of histories, it gives me a sense of understanding that I can do something. I can achieve my goal.
Thank you so much for that. I will leave it with that, and we'll come to the close of our discussion. Yasin, thank you so much for everything you've spoken and with such an honest reflection. There's so many things I've learned from this, but I've learned what displacement is. It doesn't begin with people when they cross borders. It begins, the moment when we are talked about people in different ways whose lives matter and who doesn't. But your story is very important and it needs to be told. It needs to be told because people build everywhere. People build and they try to be a part of that culture, the community. And your journey is a reflection of that. And your journey talks about survival, which has actually become an act of resistance. So to everyone listening, please don't allow Rohingya story to become another forgotten crisis. It is right amongst us. Please listen, please learn, and please speak, because silence has always protected oppression more than the truth ever has. So up until next time, keep listening, keep questioning, and keep building here in the Broken Bazaar.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you to those who are listening to this podcast. And it is an honor for me to have the opportunity to share my personal histories and the histories of Rohingya people.
Thank you, yes.
Thank you.